Is this thing on? Oh, there it is.
Are we back? Are we here?
We're here.
Okay.
Here we are.
All
Hi,
right.
everyone. It's good to see you.
Hello, everyone. Ooh, see? Look what I've done.
I would just like to correct one thing very quickly, that Ayana was my student only, on the technical registration page. She was a student at the Iowa Writers Workshop the first semester I taught there. And just by
Which
chance,
was also the semester in which he won the Pulitzer.
that
for.
old thing.
I should
You wanna see it?
add.
And it was the first time I taught there, and I felt a little over my head. Who do we have in that? Like Eleanor Catton?
Yeah, Eleanor Catton was in
and then I had Chinello Operanta and Angela Flournoy.
Yeah, it was a
and
whole.
Justin Torres.
It was a whole situation.
And I just showed up, and I think everybody was sort of like, "What the hell is this guy doing at the head of the seminar table?" And she was submitting chapters of the 12 Tribes of Hattie. I was like, "I can't really tell you anything. I can't teach you anything." So that's just
It was amazing. Paul was really instrumental. And there was one chapter I handed in, you were like, oh, hell no.
Is it? I don't remember that.
Yeah, but you were right, actually.
Well, I'm glad.
Mostly
to hear that.
mostly right.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, because I think the way that Arlo was just saying that our work is in dialogue. I think it's also we had that sort of shared time, and we also are sort of children of Marilyn Robinson to some extent. I mean, she certainly got me thinking about religion and theology and faith, and so I think that there's that.
Yeah.
In common as well, too.
Enormously.
Yeah. So we've been assigned belief.
Yeah.
Right?
It's a small topic.
Yeah, not too much to cover there in half an hour. But one thing that we were just mentioning a little bit earlier when we were talking before the show, that it just occurred to me that up until about 5 or 10 minutes ago, I was thinking about this, like I was just equating belief with religious faith. But then, so one of the things I was interested in thinking about is that there are different types of belief.
Yes.
What is belief?
Yeah. We were just thinking when we were saying, certainly we can equate it with religious belief, but there are political beliefs, there are beliefs in history, there's a belief in community, which I think is enormously present in both of our books, in which there are these communities that are not just foundational, but absolutely essential to the people that live in them. And there's a deep faith, I would think is actually an appropriate word, that these people have about these places that they have made and inhabit. Right,
and a loyalty, so
Absolutely.
Loyalty, and then that there is, I was thinking about belief also, and different types of faith, there's political faith, there's this sort of thing, and the idea that one of the characteristics of faith that I often think about is that faith is often, what you believe in or what you have faith in is often what you hope for. It's often aspirational, right? It's you have faith in this view of the world, or how people should be, ethics, or how people should be, and then you act towards trying to bring that into the world.
Yeah. And we were thinking too, I think we were thinking a little bit about whether there was and how that might be, like if there's some difference between what we might call belief and what we might call something like closer to doctrine. Right. Like when I teach, the distinction I make with students is often church with a little c, which I sort of equate with something that's much more interior and dynamic. And then church with a big C, which I equate with something that is much more doctrinal or institutional. And so it's interesting. I think that both of those things kind of play themselves out in both of our books in very different and yet oddly similar kinds of ways. Like, do you have any sort of thoughts about that, or about the way that it plays out for folks on Apple Island and what happens to or with them?
Yeah, one of the things that's interesting in the reception of This Other Eden, and it's about a racially integrated, mixed community living on a small island, and they're very impoverished and sort of beset, and they are evicted from their community by the state. And there's a character in the book named Matthew Diamond, who's a sort of missionary there, and he's very, very religious, and he sort of through the best of intentions, ends up sort of precipitating and accelerating this catastrophe. And
it really is catastrophic. If you haven't read This Other Eden, you really, really should, though it will break your heart. But you absolutely should. It's very, very, that's the whole point, right?
Right, it is, that's kind of
anyway,
ironic.
it's extraordinary. It's an extraordinary novel. Anyway.
Yeah, well, I think of it as I was writing it, I was thinking of it, it's a warm-hearted novel set in a cold-hearted world or something like that. So you said some refuge somewhere emotionally. But, so he's a missionary, and so he's explicitly acting according to what he sees are his religious ideals. But something, and often those, in comments about the book, those religious ideals were sort of cited as the source for his kind of villainy and his racism and all that sort of stuff. But it was interesting for me to see that's how it's perceived, because all of the islanders are religious, but they're much more implicitly religious. It's not doctrinaire. It's not, there's copies of the Bible, but it's sort of a lived experience. It's an idiom, but it's not explicit. And I think we were, the idea that it's prevalent in theology when you're talking about faith or belief or whatever, which is living faith, which is, it's not a set of rules, it's not a dead letter. When you're supposed to be engaged in thinking about what your faith is, what your belief is, and how it's affecting. Are you being solicitous of the people and respectful of their autonomy and integrity, as opposed to and then one of the ways that kind of faith or religiosity or belief of any sort can degrade is when it becomes doctrinaire in a way where you're just going through it by the numbers.
It's this sort of fixed, I would argue, kind of dead thing at that point, right? And at that point, it's not. I would argue how much it even is. How much it is even, and in as much as both books are sort of concerned in various degrees, the faith that we're talking about often is Christianity when we're talking about religion in both of these books, not because it's superior to anything, simply because that's the idiom in which the characters kind of exist.
Yeah.
But that it becomes sort of non-Christian once it's dead. You know what I mean? Like, right. It's not even, Yeah,
as you're saying this, I'm thinking, it's the spirit is precisely and elegantly and completely canceled when it degrades into the letter. That idea that like living according to again an unthinking kind of rote sort of doctrine cancels this, what I take to be the essential spirit of the best of that kind of religious thinking. And so I was thinking about your character Cass in that respect, because he is somebody who, he's somebody who I really, I absolutely love him as a character, and you should all read The Unsettled. It's an absolutely incredible book. I just read it for the second time flying over here. I was like, oh my God, there's like 10 times more to this than I saw the first time. It was just, it's so rich and amazing. And one of the reasons why I love Cass is because he, like Matthew Diamond in my book, could have just been a one-dimensional villain. You could have just used him as a foil. He's a bad guy. And he's one of those characters I love because I can empathize with him. I understand why he's where he is. But so the good in him and the bad in him are both absolutely, utterly true, and they don't cancel one another out, right? Or maybe you can correct, but that idea that good politics, good intentions, that doesn't mean that's those things won't get you anywhere if you're not deploying them in the spirit of mercy and kindness and gentleness and solicitude. So that's, I'm just interested in
empathy. I think so. The Unsettled is essentially It's set in two different places. It has a setting in Philadelphia and another setting in a fictional rural settlement, historically black settlement on a bend in the Alabama River. And then it has this other setting in Philadelphia. The whole thing is set in 1985. Cass, the character to whom Paul is referring, the initial part of The Unsettled is set in a homeless shelter, actually, and there's a mother and child at the center of that, and they kind of leave this place, and they become involved in, I don't know, it's kind of a political sect, it's a little bit culty, it's all very sexy and kind of deadly. But anyhow, and the leader of this thing is this man named Cass. And Cass is a complicated figure because he is, as you said, he is absolutely villainous. He's coercive. He's kind of violent. There's a lot not to recommend.
Will to power.
And
right.
Massive will to power.
Yeah.
At the same time, he is right about, it's a sort of a separatist black community established in the middle of Philadelphia in the middle of the 1980s, which are themselves a pretty turbulent, messy decade for many, many reasons. And a lot of his politics about why they need to be separatists, his critiques of things like the free market economy, all these things are absolutely impeccable. Like, it's all exactly right. And yet this doesn't save him from being a pretty bad guy. And one of the things that's interesting, I think, and then I want to ask you about Matthew Diamond, who's a very different kind of character, but similarly extraordinarily complicated villain. I think one of the things that's interesting about Cass, to kind of return to the conversation that we were having a couple of minutes ago regarding doctrinaire religiosity as a dead thing, is that it also then is very easy to recruit for the worst sorts of things, right? Like if something is dead and you don't have to think about its nuances anymore, or what it might actually be doing in the world or not doing, and it's just sort of laid out for you, or you've decided that it's laid out for you as a thing that is kind of, a body on the table, you can use it for anything. And I think the reason I thought of that is because Cass, the characters in my book are religious in various ways. But Cass is a character who is pretty much an atheist. He's a doctor. He's kind of a Marxist. But he uses Christianity a lot. Like, he sort of proselytizes about the cause of their movement.
And he's charismatic.
Exactly, he's super charismatic. So he'll just sort of, he'll use Bible verses on a bus because he realizes that he can get folks' attention. So he has kind of recruited this thing, which in his mind is no longer resonant or reverberating, aside from being an idiom that you can get to capture people's attention.
So he's recruited
he uses. Exactly. Yeah. So he's recruited it for horrible things, and kind of horrible things, I guess. But I wanted to bring that back because I was just thinking a lot about what you can do with something if you have instrumentalized it because you think that it's dead. Back the little C, big C church thing.
Yeah, and it's also, it's all the more insidious the way he uses it, because he's, to somebody who is vulnerable and wants, a structure and, something that, presenting a simplified version of just, here are the 10 steps and then we'll have a utopia or something. It becomes predatory almost, because you're tempting vulnerable people into a false belief. You're offering them a false hope.
And it's particularly villainous, it occurs to me, because you are preying on these things that are, to some extent, active or alive in a culture or in a people, right? Like, I can say these, Cass proselytizing on a bus. I can use this Bible verse because they're going to recognize it. And I can draw them in, which is extraordinarily predatory.
Yeah. And then you end up being a predator against the people that you're reputedly, nominally trying to save. So it's this so that's one of the reasons I just was so taken by him, and then placing him in the rest of the story. There's this irreducibility to it. That's because, as we were talking too, it's sort of like he's, as an individual, he's kind of had all of his rivets popped, right?
Yes.
And that's totally, you sympathize and empathize with him. But then what he wants to do is take that broken version of himself and amplify it, translate it onto a communal, level of a community, family and community, that sort of thing. So people get sort of subjected or subjugated,
by him.
Yeah.
When it happens when I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how that that happens with your character, Matthew Diamond.
Yeah,
in
so
different
that's
ways.
so again, Matthew Diamond, he's on this island as a kind of a missionary, as kind of an informal preacher, as a school teacher, one of the things he does to accelerate the eviction of everybody from the island is there are a number of young people, younger people that are in the school on the island who he teaches, who are actually quite gifted. There's a girl who's very good at Latin. There's another who's really is kind of like a math whiz or protege, and then there's a boy named Ethan who is really has an aptitude for painting, and in an effort, again, a misguided effort, that he thinks may, quote unquote, sort of save this kid, Ethan, from the catastrophe that's about to befall the island. He arranges for him to go off the island from Maine to Massachusetts, again, nominally to get an art education. But the reason he does that is because Ethan, unlike his sisters, can pass for white. So it's this kind of complicated sort of. But in the middle of all this, too, one of the things I wanted to do, I was thinking about the fact that he has racist attitudes. He holds racist beliefs. And I was thinking of also, when you're a writer, you're trying to think, I'm going to be subtle about this. I just want to make it self-evident. I don't want to have to, I want the reader to come to it. And then one day I was like, why am I doing that? Like, I took a page from Shakespeare, so that he wouldn't, in one way that I realized I could make it so he wasn't just one-dimensional, that you'd have to kind of actually think about this sort of thing, is that he is quite vehemently racist, and he knows it, and he regrets it. So and there's a line in the book that I get. So this is just by way of how I came upon this, but he talks about how much he laments the fact that he has something like a visceral revulsion whenever he is in the presence of a black person, and he realizes that goes against everything that his religious faith and belief teaches him, and nonetheless there it is. That's kind of almost universal. Like we kind of know better.
Yeah.
And I got that from Shakespeare. I was thinking, I was reading like Macbeth at the time, teaching Macbeth. And Macbeth knows the second he decides to kill the king to get the whole play is like, I'm going to go straight to hell. And so he does, that sort of thing. And that's kind of one of the things that makes him interesting. And I got that, I quote that one line because I got that from, I'm a theology nerd. I read, I teach the Old Testament, I teach the Bible, I read tons of theology, I read Calvin and all this, and I've read, all of Karl Barth's, the famous, just, within circle, a Swiss theologian who, among other things, was a member of what was called the Confessing Church during World War II. So he was in the Confessing Church, was one of the only institutions that actually actively sort of resisted the Third Reich and got Jews out of Germany and to safety. And so after all these years of just thinking of him as quite, almost like a hero, and for purposes of conversation, I just happened, after reading him for 20 years, came upon a letter, just in some obscure thing of his correspondence, in which he just offhandedly says something about like, I'm glad that my son is not afflicted with my prejudice, which is the involuntary and visceral disgust whenever I am in the presence of a living Jew. And it's the living that makes it
what gets
so
it, right?
grotesque. And so there's that. On the one hand, everything I admire about his thinking I still admire it. But on the other hand, there it is. And so to bring it back to Diamond too, is that another thing that I found that could complicate Diamond is that he has all of these complications, but not entirely unlike Karl Barth. He's pretty much the only person that actually tries to help the people.
Yeah.
Tries to act as an advocate for the people on the island.
And then it's interesting because that, whatever that kind of poison thing in him, it is both implanted in or imprinted on him or in him by the larger society in which he's operating in, and of course it ends up being everybody's undoing.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? Like, despite the fact that it's interesting. I don't know. This is a sort of an aside, but when I was thinking about the Karl Barth quote, I thought, I thought how much of a struggle that must have been, and I think we can somehow bring this back to our characters or something. God help, maybe I will be able to. I'm gonna try. This idea of, I just figured out how to do it. Okay, I'm gonna do it. Watch everyone.
Watch it. She's
Be
going to
very
stick
exciting.
that landing live without a net. Yeah, there you go. That's awesome.
He's making that living distinction. I think he's also making that distinction between, and forgive me if this is self-evident, between a Jewish person in front of him and every Jewish figure in the faith that he believes in, right? So he's making that distinction between a Jewish figure in front of him and between Jesus and between Paul and between et cetera, and on and on and on and on. Yeah. Which is really something, right? The ways in which people can intellectualize the kind of ways in which they operate and work in the world.
Yeah, and this is making me think of, depending on what it is in which you believe, whether it's voluntarily or involuntarily, because in the case of Bart, well, in the case of my character anyways, it's just like he involuntarily has that feel, but depending on what you believe and what you have, then you have this whole set, that conditions what you can see and that to which you are blind, and what you can hear, and that to which you are deaf, and what you can know, and you can't know what you don't heed, that sort of thing. Which is that's all. I'm about to give a sermon. You cannot see if you do not look. And as you were saying that too, I was thinking about, because this has come up in other events too, is I think a lot of people have a troubled relationship with Wallace Stevens.
Sure,
Such an incredible poet and just such an absolute
utter racist in every way, disgracefully so.
Disgracefully so, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm wondering if we could both think a little bit about, we've talked about kind of the ways in which we were thinking about these villainous characters, but I'm much thinking about the ways in which we could think about how depths of perception shape character in general. In your novel, there's a section that's very beautiful, in which there's all these siblings, everyone sort of interrelated, intermarried, et cetera, on Apple Island. And at one point, the young man, Ethan, who's very gifted as a visual artist, he was always drawing, et cetera. His sisters come from having gathered fruits and things like this. And they have to kind of cross a period where the part of the beach and the tide is sort of up to high, and they have to swim across it. And they're sort of trying to balance these baskets that they have. It's a very, it's a sort of everyday scene, but imbued with extraordinary beauty. But the thing that's interesting about it also is that it's told actually, right? Like the narrator is telling us, this is what happened, and they crossed this thing, and blah, blah, blah. And then it's told again, a little bit more briefly, but still through the eyes of Ethan, this talented, burgeoning artist. And then it's told yet again from more briefly still, from the grandmothers, the perspective of their grandmother. And so I was thinking a lot about how perception often of the visual world works. In your book, there was this sort of corrugated water and eddying sunlight, et cetera. But that seems to be melded somehow with forming characters and perspectives from which characters are seeing things or talking about things. And it seems elemental in this novel.
Well, that's, it's funny you should say that, because I was thinking that about your character, Duchess. So part of it is just, and we've talked about this before in other events, but I love landscape. I don't know, I grew up running around the woods in Massachusetts thinking Thoreau was here, or whatever, but so to me a lot of
As
it
one does.
A lot of this, we don't have the time to go into the religiosity, but the idea of having faith in what you see, and then that being the objective correlative. I still think to this day what I'm trying to do is finally capture in words what I used to feel when I was a despondent adolescent, in the middle of the woods at 4:35 on a November afternoon. Just like I feel just enthralled, literally, by everything, in all meanings. But yeah, and working with the different characters, different perceptions of, and the grandmother I think of her name is Esther, and I think of her as a prophet, in the way that prophets are not so much supernaturally imbued with the ability to see the future, they see where it's at.
Yeah.
And if you can see where it's at, what's going to happen in the future is not a secret.
Yeah.
So it's like if you're looking, and a lot of it has to do with speaking truth to power, and that sort of thing. But that she tells them all their begats, all their kind of like their own book of Genesis. The story begins with her sort of telling them about the flood that happened.
Quite literally, yeah.
It literally does. That I was thinking about that in your book because one of just off the right at the moment. It's got to be the top. One of the things I love the most is towards the with the Unsettled is towards the end when Duchess, the grandmother, who is in what would be something like analogous to Apple Island, she's in this astonishing landscape, and it's numinous. It's just it's super saturated with the history and the emotion and the spirituality, just the whole. And toward the end of the book, she starts corresponding and then sending cassette tapes to her grandson, Toussaint. And that's what I think of, the similar role. Like, I'm going to tell you about, here's this voice that's going to tell you your root, where you're rooted, like where you're actually, where your family has come from, and what, and that just naturally starts to impart to him. That's food for his soul when that happens, And so just that again, that perspective and what she thinks is the right thing to do for her grandson, and the way that my grandmother sees her grandchildren, and what language comes to her for that, and what language comes to Duchess to give to. It's like his inheritance. She's giving Toussaint his inheritance in a way.
Yeah, I was thinking that this prophet thing. Because certainly your Esther and my Duchess are that in a certain way. And probably my Cass is what you might call a false prophet, probably.
Yeah, I guess in some ways.
But I was thinking, it is true, right? Like often in the way that we receive these ideas, a prophet is like this is the person that's like, and then this is going to happen, and that's going to happen,
right,
etc. But I think often about, do you know Walter Brueggemann, the Old Testament scholar? I don't. So there's a great Old Testament scholar named Walter Brueggemann. He's in his late 80s. He's still living, and he talks about, he's got a book that he wrote sort of in the late 70s, very political, as well as a work of theology, and it's called The Prophetic Imagination. And the reason I think that it's relevant is just because I like to talk about it, so I'm gonna. But also,
no better reason.
I'm up here. I got a mic. But also, I think it's very relevant for our times. He thinks about the prophets in a couple of ways. One of the ways he thinks about their language, and one of the things he says is that one of the unique things and roles of the prophets in the Old Testament is that they could sort of cut through the language of the kingdom, because by the time a lot of them come on the scene, these prophets are speaking in the middle of often atrocity, either right before it, right after it, during it, or right after, meaning people carted off to Babylon and the sacking of Jerusalem, etc. And so these prophets are speaking into this, but they can speak through any kind of language of kingdom, of permanence, that can't adequately describe people's pain or anything that they actually need. And he says that they can do this because they use poetic language. Right. And it's the poetry of the language that allows them to be able to sort of cut through. And he puts it in two stages. One, he calls first the language of grief, which is the language of the pain of what has happened. And that is shot through, of course, with the events of the past, but it is also at the same time kind of forward-looking, right? Yeah. So he calls it the language of grief. And then he says, once the prophets allow and give people this language of grief so that they can speak their pain and their mourning, then the possibility opens of something else. And he calls that he calls that basically sort of the language of praise or the language of hope.
Yeah.
And I think that is
Promise.
often what, promise.
Yeah.
And I think that is often what sort of real prophetic voices are doing.
Yeah. It's almost like they have to reverse engineer the degrading and the harmful language of power and coercion, propaganda, whatever you want to call it, reset to zero, and then that puts people in a position to be receptive to these kind of promising visions, or that sort of thing.
Yeah. Like I hope that's what in these times you sort of getting a little off topic, but I wonder if what the point of all the scribbling is.
Yeah.
Sometimes I hope it's maybe somehow that a little bit in a small way. I don't know.
Absolutely. Got to call it like you see it, right? Yeah. Oh, now I've got many other things, but maybe we should open up.
I wonder if we should.
If anybody has any questions, we'd love to.
We are happy to have questions.
If you have a question, please wait for the microphone to come to you.
Is it necessary for a protagonist to have a belief that drives them?
Oh, I don't know. Just for the sake of conversation, I'll say no. But I don't know if that's right. I don't know. I'll wake up at 4 this morning going, oh my God, I was wrong. You do have to have that. But I don't know, because the way I think of it is, when I'm trying to find characters, I don't, that's not a question I necessarily ask. It's maybe something I discover about them as I get to know them better. I'm just always worried about, I really am just primarily concerned with character, and portraiture is kind of what I think of. And so I'm always like, to me it would be like, oh, if they have to have a belief, what is it? And I don't want to assign my characters anything before I knew who they are, because I don't want to then coerce them into, like, you're not acting like you believe this or believe that. And whatever I discover about what they may believe, what they may prove to believe, just being a human, they're going to, I think of, New Testament verse, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. Like, you may believe in something, but then, belief wanes. It's tidal almost, or a systole and a diastole, or something like that. And just the idea that, in St. Paul, we proceed from faith to faith, which is, to me, what's built into that idea is that the first presumption of faith or belief is that it will fail. And that goes back to, that's what doctrine makes it harder to keep belief and faith living, because you can't presume you have it. I think in the deepest wisdom literature, it's always the minute you think you've got faith, that's the moment you just lost it,
I think too, probably depends on how we might define belief, like we might define it as, it's not the same, certainly, as like a desire for something, but in a way it might, like, there's something about aspiration, and it does seem like characters kind of need to want something.
Yeah. I think
even if what they need is to obliterate their own want, that's still a wanting.
Yeah.
So that still seems like, so I think I might say yes, maybe.
Okay. We'll get drinks later and we'll talk about it.
Thanks a lot, Guy. Now we're going to have an argument later.
The beautiful thing is, like, what this actually makes me think is, it'd be interesting to have a character that has belief and a character that doesn't think that they have any, and see what happens.
Yeah.
That sort of thing. Because a lot of times, too, is that we're not equal to our beliefs. Because beliefs are often our ideals or whatever, and you don't live up to your own beliefs.
Yeah, Matthew Diamond, right? Like, the tension between what he believes in another thing that he knows is true of himself, which runs completely afoul of his beliefs.
Yeah, and for whatever her beliefs or not, Duchess is she wants to be left alone to do her, or are they like my Islanders? They're just like, it's hard. I want to take care of my family. I want to pay the bills. I want to put meal. I believe in being free to do that. But it's not something those characters would ever articulate that way necessarily.
Yeah,
Duchess
that's true.
might.
They would never
Duchess
say it
might,
that way.
But,
Yeah. Any other questions?
Paul, Ayana, thank you so much. If I understand correctly, both of your books are kind of, The Unsettled and This Other Eden, were kind of inspired by, a set of historical facts, but then you each made a conscious decision, like, to kind of close the history books and just, imagine something. So why did you talk about the inspiration in history and then the decision, like, not to write historical fiction, but to do something that's more, purely imaginative from that set of facts?
So, as I said, there's kind of two major settings. I mean, there's three, but I'll exclude one of them. One is this settlement on a bend in the Alabama River, which is called Bonaparte in the book, which is very much kind of inspired by not extant, many of them don't exist anymore, but did. There are many, many, many historical black settlements that sprung up, all of these kind of very small places, and that sprung up all over the United States during slavery, a lot during the Reconstruction period, and then some even after that. Many in the South, a few, certainly many in the North as well, a few in the Midwest. So I had that history very much in mind, but I didn't want to write one of those places exactly because I didn't want to be kind of beholden to a set of facts from which I could not deviate, which would have felt a little bit like kind of imprisoning my imagination in a certain way. So I wanted to sort of pay homage to, but not be bound by those kinds of histories. The other kind of major setting, as I said, is Philadelphia, 1985. My group is called, the group that's kind of cultish that I talked about, headed by this villainous Cass person, is called ARC in the novel. And ARC is kind of in conversation with a group that actually existed in Philadelphia from the late 60s, really until now. They still exist, a group called MOVE. For people who don't know that history, MOVE they were a black separatist group, pretty armed, of a politics that were a little bit like ARC's, very right in certain ways, and very difficult in other ways. They were not easy neighbors. They were, they composted and kept livestock, but in the middle of the 1980s in a row house in Philadelphia. So people didn't always love that, for obvious reasons, in the summertime especially. So, and they were difficult in many ways. But as you can imagine, with a group like that, they ended up in a lot of tension with the Philadelphia police. I'm from Philadelphia, I should preface this by saying this. Lots of tension with the police, and all of which culminated after many years of kind of back and forth, all of which culminated on Mother's Day in 1985 when the police evacuated the block where MOVE was living, and they proceeded to get in kind of an armed standoff, which really was a siege with this group MOVE and the people that were in the house. And this lasted for something like 14 hours, almost, during which the Philadelphia Police Department fired something like 10,000 rounds of ammunition into the MOVE house. There were 13 people in that house. MOVE fired back, so I don't want to sort of make this sound as though, but they certainly didn't have 10,000 rounds of ammunition. Anyway, this goes on and on. And the mayor at the time and the police chief are like, gosh, what are we gonna do? There's a siege, we have to end this. And the way that they decide to handle this is by loading up a helicopter and flying over the block, and they dropped a C4 military-grade explosive onto the house. As I said, there were 13 people in the house. 2 of them, a young boy who sort of inspires my character, Toussaint, and a woman, got out alive. The 11 people who remained in the house all died, 5 of whom were children. So this is a thing that happened in Philadelphia. I remember it. I was probably about 11 years old when it happened. So again, what happened with MOVE is very much a raw wound in the city of Philadelphia, as you can imagine. And for a long time was just sort of not talked about really at all. But now there are a couple of documentaries, there's a couple of books about it. So I didn't want to write that story. I didn't want to presume to take it. particularly because certain people, not many, but a couple of people actually involved, one of whom was named Ramona Africa, is alive. She just got out of prison like 2 years ago. So I didn't want to presume to tell it, but I did want to have a conversation about it and about the sort of people that might have been drawn to a place that isn't Move, but is like it. Why would they have wanted to be there? What might something like that have offered? What were the dangers of being in a place like that? What did you have to do to kind of make it work? What are the logistics? So I had a lot of questions like that I wanted to think about. And in order to think about those, I think I had to depart from Move. But I also, as I said, I just didn't feel like it was my, I thought I was going to tell a story that was much closer to what actually happened. And as I wrote into it, I was like, this isn't mine to tell.
Yeah, I have the same thing where, for various reasons, realized I'm not the right person to tell this. I kind of have a right to tell it, and I didn't. In my case too, I felt like so. You need similar thing, which is the way I thought of it is I needed to have tons of imaginative latitude, which would not be appropriate if I was writing about this island called Malaga Island off the southern coast of Maine, which was the site of a racially mixed, integrated community for about 125 years, and then in summer of 1912, the state of Maine evicted everybody from the island, and so I said this in an earlier event, but by the time I was done reading like 2 articles about it, it was already it had already just laid claim to my imagination, and so I stopped doing any research, and because I didn't want real people, historical people. It just, and again, it's just always as an artist, you have to decide like what is history, what is common history that we can write about, because that's what we are as American writers, among other things, and then what becomes trespassing. That kind of thing. And plus, my grandparents are from Maine, and so I know, and I'm from sort of small town, coastal Massachusetts, so I know too that there are descendants around, and it's like, and if you're from up there, like if somebody is from farther than 5 miles away, you're now there now, so like it's already, and then I was writing across differences of, race and gender and all that sort of stuff too, so I was just like, that's not, and what you hope too is it's just like my book is not, it's not the last word, it's the first word, it would be great if somebody wrote the history of that island, that's what you hope, and you become part of this dialogue. Your work becomes a part of a dialogue. But the same thing, I was just discovering all those communities, a lot of which you said formed during the Reconstruction, and I thought, so it's local, but it's it's regional, it's national, and then I started thinking displacement. Sure. Exile into Babylon, exile from Eden. It's this essential. Quintessential human experience, and I was dealing with, certain, like I was saying, like some editors were like, why don't you just make all the characters white? That'd be much sense. I was like, talk about erasure. What the fuck?
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Excuse my French. And then there's that weird absurdist, logic where it's just like, according to that, then I can only write novels about 57-year-old heterosexual white guys.
From Massachusetts.
Playing golf. And then you can imagine this shit, like you're damned if you do. If you called them once, you said, "Oh, those are the people with the pitchforks." Yeah, right. Like you're gonna get, and that's true, is it right? You got to own it, because not everybody is going to be, holding a parade for you. Yeah. If you write stuff that's about these subjects, they're very,
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you kindly.